do recognize that my abstract is setting up a highly complex and jargon-heavy paper that I hope to send in to the journal. The presentation today, though, is going to lighten it up just a little bit to make it a little bit more accessible across cross disciplines. I do think that we do have a recurring theme throughout today about the objectification of the wrestler's body, particularly in the dramaturgy of pro wrestling, which I just wanted to say. And in my presentation, I'm going to objectify the wrestler's body as much as possible, turn them into action figures, and particularly into digital action figures. My piece is on how video games and kind of the interactions of the story and the player in the video games inside of other narratives. My jumping off point, of course, is that the classic Freud article from 1919, A Child Being Beaten. And I really don't want to discuss that article at all because it's Freud, it's over 100 years old. We've moved on as a society and a people and a psychology and literature. We've just left it. But it really is my jumping off point for this, my understanding of this piece, because I thought about the image that Freud gives us, that very gendered of his time image of a father beating a child and the mother kind of watching on. Freud does take it to think about different relationships and how we identify with ourselves in that situation. But I don't care. For me, I was thinking about the child being beaten and how that changes when you have that scene, that image play out in an alleyway or on the street. How that would change if you did it in saw that being occurring in a subway, or a bar, or a backyard, or a wrestling ring, right? The understanding of the audience's relationship and then identification changes based on the stadium it's presented in, and in the case of the context of my talk, in the video game itself, right? And so what I really got to is Richard Maneri's idea of narrative embodiment. And that embodied narrative is the player's representation inside the story, particularly in a video game, from Maneri in 2008. And some other theorists have touched up and added pieces to it. But I like the kind of simplification in Maneri, as simple as it can be, to think about when you play a video game, what is your role and how immersed into the story can you become in that video game? Yesterday, as an aside, yesterday I was at a composition conference on the break. We were just chatting, and I mentioned coming and doing this presentation. And the English major across the table from me laughed and questioned, is there a story in a video game about wrestling? He did not question the story elements of wrestling itself, thankfully, because that probably would have sent me over the edge, but fairly asked, does a video game about wrestling have a story? And I suppose if you're just playing player against player, it's really just you against the person on the couch beside of you, then the story doesn't particularly matter, or is so hyper in that moment that it isn't applicable to the game itself. I think when we get into the player embodying and representing themselves in a story like a championship run, where we're trying to get the belt and be the ultimate champion, win the star rating, whatever video game we're playing, ultimate goal is in story mode. I think there is a story there. I think an interesting aspect of that is as we're putting ourselves into that game, we're not trying to make ourselves Link from Zelda. We're not trying to make ourselves a generic NPC that comes to power. We're not trying to really make ourselves a fictitious Belmont. We're putting ourselves into really interesting other story spaces. We become Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, China, Becky Lynch. We put ourselves into that moment. And often in these video game formats, especially the more modern ones, we're trying to recreate what we saw and have our moment in that glory, or right a wrong that we perceive if we did or did not like Cody Rhodes's last WrestleMania or this WrestleMania. Trying to take the controller into our own hands and put that character through those paces and change that narrative. And so thinking about that, became ultimately fascinated, but realized as I did a deep dive through video game history and wrestling video game history, there's an entire story missing from all wrestling video games. I'm going to throw out wrestling racing video games where you jump on Undertaker's bike and try to beat John Cena's lunch wagon or whatever, but stick to the core of wrestling video games, which are very company driven, very AEW, WWE, CF, very, even globally, New Japan. It's very company driven, very personality driven. And they often have that story mode. But what's completely missing from all the video games is the smart mark, is the idea that when you're booking matches, you don't actually always want to win. That the storyline that we talked about earlier in the presentation set, kind of lining up with the Marvel and the Bloodline, a few matches going the other direction too early in the Bloodline storyline wrecks the entire thing. If you beat Thanos in movie one, the entire next sequel movie doesn't make sense anymore, right? So sometimes we understand, especially we hold that duality of the dramaturgy of this wrestling sphere. We understand that sometimes to get over, you need to lose, and that is completely lost in the video game sphere. The video game sphere removes all the smartness from the mark, treats it completely like a shoot every time, removes the work, and misses an entire narrative potential. And so I think ultimately what my paper is about, and what I have been thinking about here lately, is the other narrative spaces that wrestling video games have yet to explore, if that makes sense. So that's me. I want to kind of do a little bit quicker piece, kind of gets back on time. So if you have any questions, I'd love to jump in and explain. If you need me to go anything a little bit differently or a little bit more deeply, please let me know. Otherwise, that was me. Thank you.
Are there any questions or comments for John?
Well, while you're formulating all the questions that I know you have, I do want to throw in a book. Now we're putting video games after poets. My research study currently is a PhD in interactive media. And so video games is a kind of side tangent for me. Interactive fiction is ultimately what I'm doing most of my research on. And there's been very few instances of interactive fiction in prose print with the wrestling branding on it. One of them being the 3-book series from the great company that does the most of the marketing. And in this, you read a section, make a choice, and move on, choose your own adventure style. Very few occurrences, but absolutely work the exact same way the video games do. Treats everything like it's real. The locker room is completely serious, and you're trying to win your big shot at the title, the belt, in the moment, depending on which book you're in. So the little bit of book we get in the same kind of interactive media sphere so far does the same thing, has the same basic problem, and is missing the same narrative potential. So I'll plug a book while we're waiting on questions. Or I'll just answer my own question. There you go.
I see Tyler has his hand raised. Yeah, he's got a question for you. And then there's one in the chat too.
Go for it, Tyler.
Tyler, are you in a spot?
Yes. So my question was, because so firstly, thank you for your presentation. I think that's really, really interesting. Especially given like this idea that like we as fans always want to win, and that we have like no concept of how to tell a story. Like what you were saying, like you have to have a story in order to finish a story. So if you beat like Roman Reigns or Thanos or insert villain here first go, then there's no struggle, so there's no story. I wanted to ask though, how do you think that character creation plays a role in like this what you're talking about as far as like having created or having like being the protagonist of a professional wrestling story, just as far as like how people may see themselves or like things of that nature?
I think that the character creation happens in one or two real aspects in this discussion. One is a created character kind of aspect that's happened in the last decade and a half in wrestling games, where you're making your own avatar, or you're bringing avatars in from other promotions, other time periods, and trying to create them. But I think the most common is going to be you making yourself Triple H, or you making yourself Herner Hurst Helmsley, or you making yourself whatever version of Paul Levine is in that video game in that moment, right? And you're then adopting their role and trying to put yourself, decide what exactly is the rock smoke I'm smelling. Is it really 316? You're putting yourself into those moments, in those spaces, in those rings, right? And I think that character creation plays an interesting role because we're willingly adopting the characters we've been presented most of the time until you get into create your own avatar and your own self-insert kind of piece. But then you still want to win, right? You don't want to lose the match and then challenge your buddy to a rematch and try again, especially on the computerized championship stuff, because you get thrown out too fast, right? I think that, thank you, Tyler, for that. I think that does hopefully dovetail nicely into the one from chat about the GM modes, where you're booking matches or you're booking the slate. That's a little bit different in a narrative aspect, closer to what I really want to see. But I'd love to see one where I don't book the matches, but I have to understand my spot in the overall storyline. I want to have a GM entity, whether it be me or a fellow player somewhere else, tells me I need to lose 3 matches to get a better booking 4 matches from now, right? And the GM mode does move around that sphere a little bit, but doesn't quite put you in the same way that grabbing that controller and picking Triple H and running with it does. So I think in both cases, you've got kind of a character creation, either the GM mode character, GM as the character that you're actually playing at that point, or the in the match piece. Both still ultimately miss peeking behind the kayfabe. Nothing really gets into the dark side of the ring aspect that we could be playing in these video games, especially on these large sandboxes we get to play in modern video games. Why not follow them home and then see their children crying because they lost the match, and you can't tell your kid, I'm going to win next week? Or do you tell your kid you win next week to get them to stop crying at home? There's a whole lot of potential here we're not playing with.